Every committal service setup is treated with the same amount of care, respect, and dignity, no matter which funeral home I'm working for, who the family is, and what type of vault we're setting. But that doesn't mean that there aren't factors at play that make each service unique, whether that be stressful, more work, more dangerous, or a setup might require thinking outside of the box. And today had many different factors, including danger. And while there were a few hiccups along the way on this committal service setup, this Trigard Elite Series Bronze Aegean is absolutely stunning. This is a style of vault that we don't see very often, so we want to make sure that everything is perfect. And it's also for a prominent family in our area. So the main difference with this committal service setup is that there may be a few more eyes on this service itself. The family is well known and well respected in our area, and this is a style of vault with a display method that we don't typically use. So there are a few things to make sure that I cross my T's and dot my I's on today. The main difference I have to account for is that we cannot use what's referred to as an ovation for this setup. In my opinion, when a burial vault this beautiful is chosen and customized by the family, the lid should be easily viewable down towards the family where they're sitting under the tent. Now this is a Trigard burial vault, and we cannot ovation a Trigard burial vault because Wilbur owns the patent on the equipment used to lean the lid down towards the family on rails and to use a winch system to pull the lid back up over the base. But that doesn't mean I wasn't going to find a way to display this lid down towards the family to where the lid is easily viewable. The only downside to this style of setup is having to use the buggy to place the lid on the base of the burial vault when the service is concluded, which is why I'll be doing an offset with the tent. If the family does want to watch the interment process, I don't want to make everyone exit while I tear the tent down to be able to put the lid on the base. And luckily, it was a sunny day, and I was able to block the wind, so even though it's still chilly, the beautiful bronze was left out in the sun to shine, and the family was still blocked from the elements underneath the tent. Now I did do one Trigard burial vault with a print over the top, and the way I set that one up is I displayed the lid on the ground in front of the base, and I really just did not like the way that it sat so low at the family's feet in the front row. So for this service I decided to bring a lot of extra equipment, extra longboards, extra 4x4s, and I built up a large platform in front of the family where I'll be able to place the lid. Now a Trigard Aegean weighs in at around 2,100 to 2,300 pounds. With the lid weighing at least 1,100 pounds of that mass, I need to make sure that the platform in front of the family is extremely stable. By using many different 4x4 boards and pieces of 4x4, I was able to interlock all the different areas underneath the aluminum boards to make sure that the vault lid couldn't shift in any direction, causing the lid to lean down even farther towards the family or to slide off the boards altogether. And with this lid on a Trigard Elite Series Aegean, it has a bronze cap, and we made a print in shop with a portrait and a slight background, but left a large border so you could still see the bronze behind the print. So while doing this setup, I need to be very cautious to make sure I don't damage the print or scratch up the bronze. And since this is a setup that I haven't actually done before, there are going to be some hiccups, and I am going to have to adjust as I set up, but I really just want this bronze to be displayed perfectly for the family when they arrive. And the same goes for the interior of the burial vault that is lined with bronze. I want to make sure that I don't drop anything into the base, but I do have a protective film that's covering the bronze at this point of the setup process that will be removed before I place the lowering device. Now is the part where things get just a little bit difficult, but it is information I can use later on. Now, I didn't have any ability to do any measurements of any kind before displaying this vault lid on the platform that I built, so it's really just trial and error. And it turns out that I didn't have enough room to place the lid from the side as I'm attempting to now. Unfortunately, the platform was just a little bit too skinny, and the boom on my buggy wasn't able to sit in between the base and the lid and still prop up the lid. It was sitting way too close to the edge, far too close for me to be comfortable with. Honestly, it was a little bit of a balancing act, trying to figure out the best way to support the lid and have it high enough to where it's visible easily to the family, but also not at too much of a height where it risks toppling over. A quick story when it comes to the prints that are done on Trigard burial vaults. They are a little bit more rare than, let's say, a Wilbur burial vault. Since we have the ability to ovation those vaults, it's much more common for family members in funeral homes to choose a setup or a burial vault with a print over the top. Now, a few years back, I lost a friend of mine. He was around my age, and he was a veteran, and one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. And I was not able to do the committal service setup for him and his family. Our company was not servicing a funeral home that uses Trigard burial vaults at that time. Now, I can't get too mad at the vault man for that setup because it was 30 to 40 mile per hour winds that day. It was drizzle and rain, and it was very cold. But my friend's vault also had a beautiful custom print on the top. A beautiful vault lid that almost no one saw. And it was a portrait. It had pictures of my friend when he was in the military, when he played football in high school, and it was an absolutely gorgeous print. The family and the funeral home did a great job customizing that and making it look incredible. Now, I say all that, and then I arrived to the cemetery, and I saw the tent setup that he had done. And he left what we refer to as a dirt wall behind the vault. So, in this situation, you will see the lid pushed down towards the family and propped up so that they can see the lid. On the service for my friend, they pushed the lid back on rails and had the print facing the opposite direction. Now, in a perfect situation, the family could simply walk around to the back side of the lid and view all that customization and the portraits. But since he used that dirt wall and did not strap it down, the wall itself sat right over the top of the lid, and maybe me and 2 or 3 other people even got to see it. And it just goes to show that the smallest little thing as a vault man that we can do to make sure the family can see those customizations and see the things that they chose for their family is so important. It also doesn't help that there were at least 20 people with their hands raised holding onto a tent pole just to try to keep that tent from blowing away, and that really took away from the service itself because everyone was worried about getting hurt. And that's the last thing I would ever want anyone to worry about on one of my committal services. Which, as I've said before, is one of the reasons why I produce these videos and do these voiceovers to try to educate other vault men on how they can do better committal services for families as well. Now, I'm doing something completely new today, but without somebody taking the incentive and trying to figure out better ways for committal service setups, then it would just stay stagnant, and this lid would have just been pushed back away from the family, and unless you were my height or so, you wouldn't even get a very good look at it because it would be above your waist. And, personally, I'd rather have people stay away from underneath the lid. Now, I trust my work, and I trust the vaults that we produce, but if a disaster ever were to happen, I wouldn't want anyone's feet or legs near the underside of the lid. And this is where I just about got hurt today. And it's completely and entirely my fault. When using a buggy like this and raising the boom up over the vault, there's a boom lock on the very top that I did not activate, which meant the boom was free to slide in towards the buggy. And luckily it does have a point where it will stop, but if I had the vault buggy at any more of an angle, it could have let that boom fly up even farther with the feet swinging around in the air, and one of those could have hit me, so I just need to pay more attention and make sure I do everything to keep myself safe. But I now have the lid placed pretty much right where it needs to go. Now it's supported with a block and another cinder block underneath, and I pushed on the lid and moved it side to side as much as I could, and I couldn't get it to budge. Now, the reason I do that is even though it may be stable when I set it down, if it were the case that someone was very emotional, and rightfully so, at the funeral itself and leaned up against the lid or placed both hands and put some pressure on that cover, or if somebody tripped and fell onto the lid, I don't want that to be able to be moved in any way, shape, or form. And since we have the lid displayed in this manner today, we won't be using our typical rails or our typical carriers for the lid itself. As for the base, we do the standard 8 reels on each end and attach the one-man bar so that both sets of feet raise and lower the base at the same level. Once I've done my reels, I can raise the base off of my wooden boards and make sure that my cables are straight and neat, making sure the vault lifts up level. If there's too many reels on one side or a kink in one of the cables, the vault base will be unlevel and that'll need to be fixed before I proceed. But now, I can lower the base down to its display height, and this simply means lowering it down into the grave far enough to where when I add my lowering device, the pistols on the lowering device can swing freely. But as I said, this is a trial and error situation. I realized as soon as I went to put my rails on that my lowering device was not going to be able to fit on the rails and open up to the 4 clicks necessary for it to be open wide enough for the casket to fit into the base. So I need to raise the lid up just a little bit higher to make sure my lowering device can fit. And I'll do that by slowly raising the lid with a tractor jack and using cinder blocks to support the weight of the lid on each side of the large block that I used to initially raise the lid to that angle. And luckily I did notice this before I took the protective film off the interior of the vault. If I hadn't done that, I definitely would not be stepping into the bottom of this burial vault to adjust the lid. But now that I know my device will fit, I can go ahead and remove the protective film and allow this bronze to truly shine out in the sunlight. And I know I've said this before, where some people don't see the necessity or the will to place something like bronze inside of a burial vault, or to have an expensive vault, or a vault in any manner, and everyone is entitled to their own opinion. Since I'm incredibly libertarian-minded, I believe that every family should have their choice, whether that be a grave liner by cemetery requirement, or a Trigard Elite Series Bronze Burial Vault. Whatever you think is right for your family member or yourself when this time comes is what I think should be available to you and your family. But now that the lid is supported and we've added our shortened rails, we can add the lowering device. And since this lid is propped up in front of the burial vault, we can use these cut down rails that are typically used for what we call false setups, when the burial vault equipment isn't actually used on the vault and the vault is placed into the grave later using the buggy. This device makes everything so much easier and safer on the pallbearers when it comes to placing the casket over the vault. The pallbearers are able to simply walk up to the first large roller you see on the left-hand middle side of the screen, and they place the casket on that roller. Once it's placed, I assist the family with guiding the casket across that first roller, over the first blue strap, up the guide bars, and over the second set of pistols, before stopping at the casket brake on the opposite end. Without this style of device, it would be dangerous to put the casket on because there's no way for the pallbearers to straddle both sides of the base of the vault, especially with the lid sitting up on the platform as it is. Once the lowering device has its guide bars and safety bars installed, we can add our T-carpets that cover up our equipment and move on to placing the handles on the cover of the vault. Now, these handles are solid metal, but they are strictly decorative. And unfortunately, we didn't have the right bolts. I'm not entirely sure if we didn't get sent the correct bolts, or if the bolts that we use in the shop to place rebar through the lids of the vaults when we produce them weren't long enough, but the bolts didn't quite have the length to get through the handle and attach to the lid. This actually worked out better in the long run, because to place this lid back over the base of the vault, I would have had to remove the handles anyway. So we used some high-strength adhesive to attach the lid handles right over the tops of the caps that I used to cover up the screw holes. And when it's time to place the lid over the base, I can remove those caps and put the screws back in so that I can lift the lid to place it back on the base. Now, typically speaking, I'm more of a fan of being able to use the lid rails and the lid carriers to push the lid back over the base and raise the base into the lid. But on a situation like today, I'm really just weighing the pros and cons, and using the buggy after the service is completed to place the lid is a little bit of a downside, because if the family does want to watch the sealing and lowering process, I'd prefer to not use heavy equipment. But since it's just placing the lid, I momentarily will run the buggy and drive it up to the backside of the vault base and raise the lid back over the base and set it down. I'll then remove the buggy and continue the sealing and lowering process by hand. So in my mind, I was just trying to weigh the pros and cons of having the lid displayed in a better manner, but having to use the buggy, or do I display it in a normal manner where it's harder for anyone to see, but in a manner where I can still seal and lower the vault by hand. I believe the way I displayed this vault lid worked out very well, and the family was incredibly moved by seeing this custom bronze cap lean down towards the family. So I think, in the end, I made the right decision in creating this setup the way that I did today. Now, as I said earlier, I am doing what's referred to as an offset, and typically you see this style of tent setup in the summertime when it's warm out. In the wintertime, or if it's raining, we generally set the tent over the burial vault to make sure that if it's raining, no rain gets on the vault or the casket, and when it's cold out, we can use walls to cover all sides of the tent and try to keep any of that cold air out, especially when we use heaters. Now, today, I set my straight wall on this side first, and then realized I needed to move it to the other side. The family would be entering from this side of the tent, and the wind is coming straight out of the north. So technically, this wall on the side doesn't block as much wind as the wall on the end will, so I could have placed it on either side and still had that effect of keeping that cold air out. So I was able to switch my long straight wall and then add my dirt wall on the back, which helps deflect the wind up and around the tent. And as I mentioned with the story earlier about my friend who had passed, setting a proper committal service tent is incredibly important. It doesn't matter if you have a beautiful vault and a beautiful setup done with the vault. If your tent is moving and the hooks are clanging around and poles are lifting up and walls are flapping around, no one is going to feel safe and comfortable underneath the tent to be able to focus on the service that's happening. And as vaultmen, one of our main priorities is making sure that we don't take away from the committal service experience from the family in any way. Whether that be having equipment like your tent with holes in it and the family's getting rained on. If that tent has holes, it can leak onto the chair covers, and no one wants to sit on a wet chair cover at a funeral. If we place the walls up but it doesn't block the wind, people may be too focused on staying warm than actually being able to focus on the committal service and the grieving process. If a vault man does his job right, for the most part, most people don't know he exists. A lot of families believe that the funeral home themselves come out to the cemetery and set this all up before the family arrives. And that's perfectly okay by us, because that just means that we did work that's good enough that the family expects that the funeral home did it, the ones that have been taking care of them throughout the entire process. Another good tip for the vaultmen out there is to make sure that your walls are staked down flush to the ground. If they're not, the wind's just going to come right up underneath the walls, and a lot of times it makes the walls whip around in the wind, which can be pretty loud. It's now time to set our 12 chairs, 12 chair covers, and our tissues. It's at this point where I transition to thinking more about the finer details and the little things I could do to make sure the setup is perfect for the family. We first place our 12 chair covers, and we keep the chairs in tight and snug together. Obviously, these people will know each other well, and it won't bother them to sit close to each other, and the tighter we get the chairs in, the more room under the tent we have for more family members to get out of the elements. Now, some people have asked why we set 12 and not 15 or 20 or 6 or 10, and honestly, I don't have a good answer for that. It's what my company's done for a very long time, and that's just our standard number. A funeral home can always request more chairs, especially if there's family with a lot of people who can't get around very well. I've set as many as 50 chairs on one committal service before, but 12 is our standard, and our tissues are placed on each chair. And on every Trigard burial vault, we place the trademark at the end of the vault. Now, I've been at this setup for around 3.5 hours now, and typically it doesn't take that long. But on days like today, I prefer to clock in early and use that trial and error to try to do the best committal service setup that I can. And it's now time for the final touches. And I just want to take a clean microfiber cloth and go over this bronze cap to make sure that any of the adhesive or any of the liquid that we use to apply this print is wiped clean, and that this bronze is free of fingerprints or any other debris from the setup process. It's an honor to set a vault like this. I've only seen 2 bronze line vaults from Trigard, in the past years that we've been working for a funeral home that offers this vault. And if a family chooses a vault such as this, it should be perfect. It is a very expensive and very high quality burial vault. And with any vault that we produce that comes with a carapace or a cap that has a print on it, we also offer bookmarks to the family that match the cover of the vault. And just like with the chairs, if the family requests more than the typical 5 or 10 that we add into the envelope, we can always produce more and have those delivered to the funeral home or delivered directly to the family. So while I conclude this committal service process, I'm thinking about everything I could do and can do in the future for a burial vault like this, or for other vaults that we have in situations such as this. While some setups are quite repetitive and we do a similar style of setup every day, I do like to make sure that I am thinking outside the box to make sure that the committal service is as unique to each family as possible. And especially on a service like this where I know multiple family members who will be in attendance, and I want to represent myself and our company and make sure that this family knows that we're here to do whatever we can to create an environment in the cemetery where they're free to grieve their loved one and experience the committal service process without the feeling of danger or uncertainty with any of my work. And with the vault sealed and lowered, it's time to place this beautiful piece of art and this soul who has passed into their final resting place. And while for the majority of my career, I'm able to separate myself from the grief that the family is feeling as they lose their loved one, but there are times such as this, where the work is done, and I may take a few minutes to reflect on the life that was lived, and to remember just how sensitive and just how fragile life in general is. I think about the friends and the loved ones that I have lost in the past, and reflect on the thousands of families that I've serviced over the years. It's truly a delicate balance to be a vault man, because if you connect yourself too much to the families, the sense of grief and despair will be ever prevalent in your mind. But at the same time, a vault man can't become calloused or bitter, because then we won't provide the highest quality service possible, because we won't have that care in our heart that we should have. It's always my hope to do the best that I can for the families that we service. Take care, and God bless.